Motion carries. Moving to our financial items, may I have a motion for item D1, approval of request for travel report?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Dr. Cohen. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for item D2, approval of bill list?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for item D3, approval of bill list?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. I have a motion for item D4, revision of 2015-16 school district budget.
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Dr. Cohen. Is there any discussion? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. Item D5 is receipt of board secretary's report and monthly certification of budgetary status. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, this item will be reflected in the minutes. May I have a motion for item D6, Board of Education's monthly certification of budgetary major account fund status, November?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Shaw, second by Mrs. Becker. Is there any discussion? Secretary, please call the roll.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. Item D7 is receipt of treasurer's report, November 2015. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, this item will be reflected in the minutes. Item D8 is receipt of enterprise profit and loss reports, November 2015. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, this item will be reflected in the minutes. We have a motion for item D9, approval of official signatories.
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
It's a roll call on D10.
Okay, may I have a motion for item D10, withdrawal from capital reserve account?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mrs. Shaw, second by Mrs. Becker. Is there any discussion? Secretary, please call the roll.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. May I have a motion for item D11, approval of fees?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Dr. Cohen, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving to our personnel items, are there any items that need separating? Okay, seeing none, may I have a motion for item E1, certificated personnel?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yep.
Mrs.
Yes.
Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. May I have a motion for item E2, non-certificated personnel?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? Secretary, please call the roll.
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. May I have a motion for item E3, community programs?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Dr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Mr. Philipchak?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mr. Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. No old business. Are there any committee or organization reports?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw.
The Student Services Committee met on January 11th. This was Mr. Lieberman's first meeting as our new director. He conducted several interactive exercises that allowed committee members to experience learning from the point of view of a learning disabled child. So very interesting and informative, and I appreciate the efforts of all involved in those exercises because it really put us on the spot. We also had a variety of updates in terms of special education. We heard about crisis prevention intervention, the one district concept, as well as the inclusive school grant. Along the lines of social emotional learning, we learned a little bit about the Superflex curriculum for our youngest learners, which helps all kids learn to navigate social situations. I wanted to announce that sibling groups are now being started for siblings of children with disabilities. Peer mentors for kids with disabilities are now available in grades 6 and 7. And also, our Sources of Strength program is another source for mentors and friendships among different groups of kids, including children with IEPs. We also heard from Shannon Campbell regarding student services and the guidance department. There is some staff transitioning going on. So happy to announce that we have an additional 2 counselors at the high school and 1 at Churchill Junior High. And although the increase in the number of counselors has resulted in the reassignment of the students, which can always be a little disconcerting, as we've heard from some of our kids who have gone through this, I believe in the long run it will certainly be worthwhile. We also heard an update on the scheduling process and also about Alumni Day that was held on December 18th. We had 65 grads return from 30 different colleges, and I see in our Clarion that we had a good write-up from our current students about Alumni Day. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other committee or organization reports? Go to the, Mr. McAvoy.
The Technology Committee met this evening at 6 p.m. prior to the Board of Education general meeting. And Mr. Leopold and Dr. Valesky took us through some general infrastructure and hardware updates ranging from bandwidth, edge switch upgrades at the high school, fiber optics, and the big one, the Novell to Microsoft migration. There were application support updates on Business Plus, disaster recovery, and our new IEP software. The Sunera update was provided, and it is a 9-page document, so my fellow board members can contact Mr. Leopold to get a copy of this. It is a working document that Mr. Leopold has been working with since he came on board with us. And during the good of the cause, it was announced that 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders throughout the district would be receiving wireless connections, and there will be an additional Chromebook card supplied to each one of those elementary schools. Thank you.
Any other committee?